Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, A Catalyst for Good, How AI is Helping the Fight Against COVID-19, a conversation with Ken Mulvaney, founder and executive chairman of Benevolent AI. This webinar is part of Georgetown McDonough's Stanton Distinguished Leader Series. My name is Sean McGilly and I am the Director of Corporate and External Partnerships for Georgetown McDonough, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to share a few webinar tips and reminders. This webinar broadcast is being recorded. The recording of this webinar will be made available on Georgetown McDonough's YouTube channel soon after today's broadcast. Our panelists will take a few questions toward the end of today's program. Thank you to those who have already submitted your questions. Please do feel free to send in your questions as you have them throughout today's program, using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Finally, if you're having any technical difficulties or other issues, please submit those concerns to our tech team via the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Now, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Paul Almeida, Dean and William R. Berkley Chair and Professor of Strategy at the McDonough School of Business.
Thank you, Sean, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this conversation on how AI is helping the fight against COVID-19 with Ken Mulvaney and Maggie Little. And I'm very excited about this topic and about our speakers. This program is part of our Stanton Distinguished Leaders Series, which hosts leaders who are renowned in their fields to share their unique experiences with our students and alumni. The series was made possible through the support of Georgetown parents, Daniel and Mary Stanton, and we're grateful to them for their dedication to Georgetown McDonough. I don't need to tell you, these are complicated times. The world we live in today is not the world we were living in just a few months ago. We have several researchers at Georgetown McDonough focused on AI and the future of work. And they've been doing this work long before COVID-19 moved us into this virtual environment. We're in the process of launching Technology, Dignity, and the Future of Work, an initiative at Georgetown McDonough that will engage students, faculty, staff, alumni, and indeed the broader community in this increasingly important topic. Just last month, we launched a new Master's of Science in Business Analytics degree, which is aimed at future business leaders interested in learning how to understand and use data to create, share, and sustain value. The program, which starts in January, leverages the hallmarks of Georgetown McDonough, our caring community, our global network of alumni, as well as individualized attention from our faculty and staff. Our students will gain a perspective that translates data analytics to provide value for both an organization and perhaps just as important, to society. That's what we do at Georgetown. We explore topics and ways to add value and make a positive impact on the world. Today's program is going to look at how business and technology are being used to move us out of the COVID-19 crisis. And we have a very special guest. Ken Mulvaney is a serial entrepreneur and investor with more than 20 years of business leadership experience. He is the founder and chairman of Benevolent AI, a $2 billion machine intelligence company with end-to-end drug development capabilities. Ken was previously founder and CEO of Proximogen, a leading biotechnology company developing medicines for central nervous system disorders, which he sold in 2012. Ken was the chairman of the trustees of the Cure Parkinson's Trust. He's a passionate environmentalist, philanthropist, and sits on several advisory boards, including the advisory panel to the UK government on artificial intelligence and the advisory board for Oxford Science Innovations. The World Economic Forum listed Ken as the technology partner in 2018. And since then, he's become a member of the all-party parliamentary group on artificial intelligence. As if this wasn't enough, Ken's passions also extend outside technological innovation. He's an avid mountaineer and world champion sailor. I just want to note, Ken, that you made me feel completely inadequate. Having scaled many of the world's highest mountains and competed in the 1992 America's Cup. So welcome, Ken.
Oh, thank you.
My colleague, Maggie Little, will be moderating the conversation with Ken. Maggie is a wonderful colleague. She's a senior research scholar at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics and a professor of philosophy here at Georgetown. Her research interests include issues in reproduction, clinical research ethics, data ethics, and the structure of moral theory. I'm also grateful to Professor Jason Schlotzer for inviting our guest today, and I'm grateful that Jason is leading our Technology, Dignity, and the Future of Work initiative. It's now my pleasure to turn the conversation over to Maggie and Ken.
Thank you so much, Dean Almeida. It's always a pleasure to have an opportunity to see your face, even if it's virtual. As I mentioned to our guest speaker, Ken, I'm particularly excited for this conversation. The idea of taking new technologies that harness AI and applying it to the social good is already a deeply important issue. And then finding somebody who's doing it in a way that addresses an immediate, urgent, and global pandemic is really inspiring. So Ken, I wonder if we could start. I would love for you to tell a bit about the company itself, first of all. So Benevolent AI, tell us about what it is and what it does. Would love to hear a little about the origin story, how you founded it. So give us your intro to what must be one of your most treasured objects in the world, this company.
Well, thank you very much. And please, thank you so much for, that was one of the kindest introductions I think I've ever had. So thank you very much. And you can hear me and see me well enough? Okay, great. Yeah, so Benevolent was founded really out of a previous biotech experience, Proximogen, which I had founded probably 10 years before that. And we were looking at some very, very difficult diseases. What was fascinating, not coming from a drug discovery and development background, coming from medical background, but not from those disciplines, the trial and error aspect of drug development, I just found, wow, fascinating that such a high proportion of drug candidate programs, drug development programs will fail along the way. And I think that the figure remains to be somewhere in the mid to high 90% of all programs that you start will not make it through the drug development process. And I saw that firsthand. And what sat within Benevolent was typical of what you would see within any other normal biotechnology company or within divisions of pharmaceutical companies, where scientists would come together, discuss the disease. Many were extremely well-read, well-networked, and they had colleagues. They'd go to conferences. There was always a lot of discussion and debate that happened on the initiation of a particular disease program that we were looking at. And I didn't know really any different from that. I had a strong technology background before then. Stepping into the drug development seemed to be a trial and error sort of endeavor, and it turned out to be. And we recently celebrated the first of the drugs from that company coming onto the market about 2 years ago. So that process was about 8 years to go from the inception of an idea through patients and then ultimately approval. And that's relatively fast, actually, because so normal metrics within pharma would be even more so than that. And then when I sold Proximogen, I really was thinking, God, there just must be a different way to look at information. And everywhere where there is a big mismatch between humanity's ability to generate information and our ability to synthesize and make sense of that information provides that sort of opportunity. And then kind of going back to 2012, there wasn't a lot around deep learning in understanding the written word. There's deep learning around images. There was deep learning around gaming, but understanding the structure of a sentence, the sentiment of a sentence, was just beginning. So we really stepped into a relatively new application of learning technologies. And where the real challenges were for that was understanding what truth is in a statement, or in a concept. And in science, that's particularly important because you can have a disease which manifests itself a certain way in one type of patient and another way in a different type of patient. And the nuance of understanding the context of the disease. And what I set for my developers is I said, and at the time I was over 40, so I was able to say, I said, if there is a gene that upregulates a disease process, I don't want to know whether 10 scientists say it does and 9 scientists say that it doesn't, therefore it does because one more scientist say that it does. There's a fidelity of that information that I need to understand. I want to be able to answer the question that this gene upregulates this process in men who are over 40 under stress. And that's the context with which that statement is true. So building those kernels of truth, having an epistemological understanding of what truth is important because there's so much information in the medical space. There's so much being published every day. I think there's some 400 new life sciences publications every day that come out. So if you're in a discipline as we were trying to understand underlying cause of, say, a neurodegenerative disease with a whole bunch of incredibly talented scientists, their information is imperfect because they're not able to consume all of the information that's available. They can only consume what they can consume. And for actually, I'm sorry, there's 10,000 new publications every day.
Sounds right.
Yeah. And so the average scientist will only glean, hundreds of those over the course of that year, rather than be able to consume all of that information. So apologies for that. So what I wanted to try to do is not replace my scientists, but actually augment their ability to surface information that they otherwise wouldn't be able to find connections that they wouldn't have been able to really think to interpret is associated with the disease. That was really one of the challenges. And what it helped us do is it helped us redefine what disease is entirely. Not entirely, but largely, I think is fair to say. Because when you present to a clinician with a series of symptoms, the clinician itself will, okay, well, I've seen these lab values, I see these symptoms, the disease is X, and so many patients are held together by a common diagnosis rather than a common etiology, a molecular cause of that disease. And that's what this type of technology is very good at doing. It's unpacking the disease in an unbiased way and not labeling it as this person has tremor, resting tremor, this person has gastrointestinal issues, this person has, therefore he has Parkinson's disease.
Yeah,
Parkinson's
really peek under the hood.
Yes,
of
exactly.
the disease and understand it better so we can be more precise and not just give broad diagnoses, but really understand what is happening with that patient.
At the molecular level, yes.
So if I'm hearing you right, you had an experience of drug development with one of your prior companies and saw firsthand that as smart and genius level as these groups of scientists are, and as good as we are, at doing many types of investigation. Understanding disease and finding a treatment are things that currently or historically have been, I heard you say, both highly labor intensive and take a very long time, and also have a lot of guesswork along the way. So you have high attrition. You start with 100 ideas and only 5 or 10 will make it across the finish line, because we start with hypotheses. Yes. And they're pretty fallible, and it takes a long time to find out, whoops, that didn't work.
Yes.
And that with that experience under your belt, then you also knowing about the potential for AI, thought, I wonder if this technology offers a way to do that disease understanding and drug development differently, so that we can achieve solutions faster and more reliably, which, by the way, means less expensively, which helps the public as well. Okay, so I just said, so you with your experience in AI thought this could be a new tool. So let me ask you, and I know most of our audience is very familiar with AI, but people have different levels of technical understanding. And I don't want you to take us, down to the level of the mathematical models, okay? But I don't know. When you're at a cocktail party, Ken, and you say you work in AI, if somebody said, "What is AI?" How do you describe it? How do you try to make it accessible to people?
Sure. Well, here's something interesting. We don't have a master algorithm that does the things that we do. So I think, and this is probably going back some time, so the number may have changed, but not too long ago, we had 113 different algorithms that did very specific processes within the pipeline of drug development. And that would be from, trying to unpack what a disease is, what would be, what makes rational sense for this disease to be true. Where can I fill in the dots of that? And I think that that master algorithm, where we're identifying diseases, called Optimus Prime. I didn't name it. It was named by some of our developers. And it's one of the most fundamental aspects of how we work. And what that's doing is, I think of it like a puzzle. And it's constantly competing against itself to get a best fit of understanding of a disease. You have a series of symptoms, you have a series of values, there's genes that are involved in that process, there's upstream regulators, downstream, there's all sorts of things happen. There's all this information that's out there. Some of it is accurate, some of it is inaccurate, much of it is unknown. And what it does is it competes with itself by say that it has 10 pieces of information. And if you try to fill in 100 pieces, it has 10 pieces of information. And by taking out 2, you can add another 10. So it's constantly trying to fill the puzzle in by replacing things, making assumptions of best fit processes that are in there. And that's probably the main piece of it is kind of filling in, gaming against itself in an adversarial network, trying to determine what the underlying mechanistic cause of a disease is. And then there are other things in terms of understanding chemical space as an example, and that's completely different. In this, the type of learnings the type of deep learning that we develop here and other companies like us develop, a lot of it is around, I guess gaming against itself. And in chemical space, that is entirely the case as well, because a very, very good scientist can look at a molecule and say, this is a drug-like molecule. Mm-hmm. Right? Very, very good scientists can say, it has the right polarity, it has the right size, it's not too big, it's going to get into the brain.
When you say drug-like molecule, you're talking about this is a type of molecule that could be used for a therapeutic purpose, that we could pull it together and know when to inject it into a patient or give them a pill with that molecule.
Yes. Before
not all molecules are good candidates.
That's right. Whatever this drug candidate does, the body needs to be able to absorb it. It needs to be able to distribute it to the right tissue. It needs to be able to metabolize it. It needs to be able to excrete it. These are properties of a molecule that if you don't have them, it's never going to be a drug because let's say it doesn't get absorbed, into the body. So, and very, very good chemists, the very best, can with some 90% accuracy determine whether something is drug-like. Whether it works or not, I don't know, but actually whether it has the properties of a drug-like. And one of our first thing was actually we competed against these scientists and learned from what they thought was drug-like. First, we can take all of the things that are drugs and all of the things that are not drugs, and we can do a very quick screen of learning what those properties are. Size matters, polarity matters, all of those things. And then once you and we're superhuman in our ability to determine whether something is drug-like relative to the chemist that we used as our test case. But then you can then apply that to the entirety of chemical space. So where as a human scientist uses their kind of go-to reactions of things, a computer isn't constrained. So in our chemistry universe, it's 10 to the 17 molecules, which is
you can look at to assess.
Yes. And then we can get subsets of those. And it's just so massive compared to all of humanity's current molecules.
So so first of all, so super cool. So what I hear you saying is you have developed a series of algorithms. It's not just one master algorithm, but what each of them does is serves as kind of as you say, a game against itself to optimize, and very, very quickly, powered by the strong computational power, be able to try to find the best hypothesis of what is actually going on here, and do it much more rapidly than we could do. And then also once it has that kind of hypothesis or a set of understandings, it can use that to then evaluate massive numbers of things that it would take humans a much longer time to do. So your ability to both understand what's really going on and then take that understanding and apply it to lots of types, for instance, of molecules is massively larger. Yeah. And one thing I remember somebody describing, AI as, at least certain kinds of AI, like the type you're talking about, as a lot of sort of pattern recognition of trying to take a lot of data and see with some parameters given, what associations are hidden in this massive amount of data that a human might not see. So is that does that sound right to you? Is that a piece of what you all are leveraging?
Yeah, I think the pattern recognition is incredibly important, particularly when the data is in a structured format. So this would be information that you would see in an Excel spreadsheet or in a genomic database, as opposed to unstructured, which would be something written in a sentence. The complication around something written in a sentence is expression is incredible, particularly in scientists, where they say, the results show, it's generally the best results show that, and some other ones didn't show that at all.
Yes.
And so trying to understand nuance, conviction, and the way that a concept is held together, because a concept it may not just be a statement in a sentence, it may be a statement in a paragraph, and how that's kind of the essence of that paragraph, how it relates to the paragraph before or after. All of these things matter in trying to understand it. And we get much of our information in the unstructured format because it is the most part of it. We do everything where, image recognition, that's in the figures, we obviously ingest all the data, and we score data differently. So if something appears in, say, a table in a figure of a paper, we consider that primary data as opposed to the interpretation of what the scientist says that data means.
So let's turn to that, what you're calling unstructured data, where what you're having your deep learning system look at is not an Excel, it's not an image, it's not a bunch of properties of a molecule, cool as that is, and you do that too. But this really comes into, this turns us to your work on COVID-19, because if I'm understanding it, part of what you're doing is searching the scientific literature. So that's that unstructured data that you were talking about scientists publishing results and talking about their results, and ingesting thousands of pages of this kind of literature with the knowledge that's embedded in it in such nuanced ways. And from that, tell me if I'm getting it right, trying to isolate and find some hints about what existing drugs, already approved drugs that are out there, because they're shovel ready, right? They're on the shelf now, might actually be able to be repurposed to be treatments for COVID-19. So first of all, have I got that right?
Yes, yeah.
Can I ask, how did you come up with this idea? I mean, it's probably the first thing that occurred to you once, you know, you were quarantined and wanted to get out of quarantine. It's like, how do we do this? But how did you guys think of this idea? And the idea of doing it for the common good, and you're giving away whatever you find from these efforts of isolating some drugs, and you've already found some candidates that you've shared with drug development companies, if I understand it right. So you wanted to do this to help the world out of this pandemic. So yeah. Talk to us about that.
Sure. We've routinely, well, it's, you know, the motto of benevolent is not just a name. So we do try to be benevolent in the things that we do. We routinely give IP away where we think.
Intellectual property. Yep.
There was just such an overwhelming need in this particular case, where we focused our challenge, where we focused our efforts on the COVID challenge was really what happens when patients get to the hospital. We weren't sure, and nobody was, what the efficacy was going to be with the various antivirals that were out there, whether it was remdesivir or others. We didn't know, right, because it was a new disease, and you know, there's very marked differences between COVID-19 and SARS, and so we didn't know what was going to happen, but we were aware of what's happening in the hospital. So when patients were dying, they were dying generally from acute respiratory failure. You know, this was a hyperactive immune response.
Right.
So looking at something which is immunosuppressive doesn't require a lot of AI to do this, but
it's intuitive to think maybe that's what we need to look for, is something that, so just to remind our audience. So one of the things COVID-19 can do is, am I getting the word right? The cytokine storm?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
People have seen that word in the newspaper maybe, that part of what the virus seems to do is to trigger the immune system going crazy and overworking, and a storm that itself can then cause damage, not the virus, but our immune system working in a haywire extra way. So as you were saying then, so a bunch of people thought, well, intuitively, let's look for drugs that would tamp down our own immune system to take away that cytokine storm damage.
Right.
Okay.
That's
Keep
right.
going.
And if you look at antivirals, they're not designed to tamper down a cytokine storm. That's not what they do. And an immunosuppressive could be kind of counterproductive when you're trying to prevent a virus from getting into the cells. So the challenge for us—
if it dampens down our immune system, it might let the virus go. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So there was a very fine line that we asked of, we call it JAX, for a judgment augmented cognition system. So we asked JAX to help us.
Oh my God.
Where we could.
Every AI system needs a good nickname.
Where we could try to thread that needle and have something that was immunosuppressive and also antiviral. And obviously nothing comes up because it just wasn't known how something like a kinase inhibitor is going to have an antiviral effect.
I see.
so it took actually a machine to determine that via this mechanism downstream, there's what's called a num kinase effect, that what it's doing is it's binding the virus as it would normally do, but it's preventing the bound virus from being trafficked into the cell. And it just wasn't intuitive at all that what was a rheumatoid arthritis drug would have an antiviral effect. And then, so we published on that early February, I think. And it was in patients probably by mid-February. So this was in, this would have been in Italy. So when Italy,
was surging, yeah.
It was surging in Italy, and the clinicians there, the physicians, were just distraught. They didn't have the equipment. They didn't know what was happening. People were put on ventilators. Their trajectory was poor from the start, so we gained traction at maybe 8 or so different centers within northern Italy. And then kind of propagated that out. And these tended to be smaller investigator-led, so 50 odd patients rather than 1,000 patients, which is where it's currently being trialed at the moment, alongside remdesivir. And when we published our first one, we said we should put this with remdesivir, and it just so happens that that's we said that back in back in February. But anyway, those initial studies,
sorry, I see what you mean about, so you're looking for, almost from a human perspective, a needle in a haystack, a drug that would tamp down the overreaction of our immune system, but still attack the virus. And that's a lot to ask.
Yeah.
And that your JAX, your deep learning system, looked through a lot of information and was able, again, to sort of, because it can get at such a granular level about properties of drugs and things like this, to find a drug, happened to be an anti-rheumatoid arthritis drug, if I got you right, that actually would have those properties. And because it was able to sift through so much data and in a really analytically powerful way, you get a candidate fast and then can start looking at it.
Yeah, so I think that the first series of from the point where we queried the system to when we had a hypothesis which was validatable, because it's less useful if there's no way to validate whether something works or not. So there are still
a lot of work to do to make it. Yes.
Yeah, well, just kind of generally, when I think of our system, we still have some of the same bottlenecks that pharma has, right? Because we still have to test the hypothesis, and we still have to run it through normal clinical trials.
Yeah, you have to try it in humans in the way the FDA is going to allow you to do it, which is for the protection of all of us. Yeah.
So within, I think it was maybe 4 days, we had enough confidence in our hypothesis to send that. We sent it, I think, to the Karolinska Institute in Sweden to determine whether or not this actually has the antiviral properties that our system is predicting that it should have. And within probably 10 days, it was in patients. So within 2 weeks, we were already in patients, and that is fast. Anecdotally, when I think of it in terms of what our first drug being approved on the market in patients at Proximogen was 8 years.
The previous company.
Yeah, to be in large scale clinical studies. And now they are quite large scale clinical studies within months is
amazing.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask, so where is it now, and what do you think the future trajectory of this particular drug is as a potential treatment for at least some COVID-19 patients?
Yeah. So, this is treating patients who have been admitted to the hospital. They may have received some positive oxygen, but they're not on a ventilator. So they're sick enough to make it to the hospital. And just kind of going through some of the other criteria, we had softer criteria as well. So, for instance, Roche's IL-6 drug came up on our list, not as an antiviral, but as a potential cytokine storm dampener. But it's an injectable. It's not easily administered in the hospital. It has to be administered for a long period of time. It's very expensive. So we had softer criteria around the need as well that we're able to input into the system.
Have I got it? So not only did you want the biomechanical properties, it can dampen a cytokine storm, but we also want the drug to be able to be antiviral. But you're pointing out, you were thinking of the social context of use. If your goal is to help humanity, not just, your softer criteria, it sounds like you're saying we want something that could be more easily used across a lot of different resource and clinical settings.
That's right.
Yeah, and that could be affordable so that we could actually save lives at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Okay. And that was this anti-rheumatoid drug that you found.
Yeah. And there are many rheumatoid arthritis drugs out there. This one just happened to have the right antiviral property, and it's a substantial dampening of viral entry. So it's not, it's not kind of marginal. It's
so very promising. So what other steps need to happen before this treatment might be available? So you say that still takes time. So where are we in that and
so it started treating patients very early. So these were clinicians, and it still does, who have patients.
In the research context.
Yeah, in the research context, investigator-led studies. And at the moment, it's in 2 large clinical studies. One is with the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases.
Tony Fauci's shop.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah.
And I think that's about 1,000 patients. And that should have its interim readout soon, but it passed its feasibility study some weeks ago. So these are studies that say to continue.
I was going to say big, keep going.
Yeah.
This works, and we need to find out more about it and confirm, but it's more about confirming rather than in principle maybe. Yeah. So that's extremely exciting.
And then Lilly, who are the owner of the rheumatoid arthritis molecule, they were kind of inspired by the work that had been done by the clinician-led studies. And so they've also commissioned their own large phase 3 study,
I see.
which is ongoing as well, and that's not using remdesivir. It's as a standalone, just because
as a standalone.
Yeah, because remdesivir, again, we had hypothesized the use of that, but that itself is also a complicated drug that has to be administered over a fairly long period of time.
I see.
In specific hospital settings, but it's also not, if you're in, let's say, a development world, you don't have a lot of refrigeration, you can't have that.
Exactly. We need to pay attention to which of the drug candidates. We want to pursue many, but we need to keep our eyes on the prize of all kinds of people. It's a global pandemic. It doesn't choose, right? Just people who are highly resourced. And so we need something that we actually can use for the whole globe and not just a select few. Amazing, and I have to say very inspiring. I want to turn now to we've got some questions from the audience. A bunch of super cool, including somebody who wants to hear about sailing, and you're sailing, but I'm going to wait on that one. If we have time, we'll get to that. One of the questions was on continuing on the connection to COVID-19. So one question somebody asked is, do you have any, have you heard of anything about how AI might be being used to predict community spread? So very different, not the treatment and drugs, but just the sort of public health epidemiology surveillance. How do we figure out where flare-ups are going to happen so that we could direct resources there?
Yeah, we ourselves don't work on that. I do sit on some of the parliamentary panels that discuss this not only in the UK but also trans-European and also between the US and in Europe as well. And they use fairly sophisticated surveillance techniques through phones and social media to gather information to determine how something is tracking. It's not dissimilar to how years ago Google was tracking the movement of the flu.
The flu, yeah.
In communities. It's just more invasive than that, just because of the potential impact that it has on the economy, and it's a very, very bad disease. So it's able to use more resource to try to understand where things are moving. And these would include things like track and trace programs, but also gatherings and using cell phone data and all sorts of,
Right.
Of
How many people with cell phones are congregate? What did you mean by it's more invasive? What did you mean?
Well, for me, when
in terms of privacy invasive.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. So if I think of it myself in an area and someone knows where I am because they're, I don't know, looking at my cell phone data, that to me sounds invasive, but I guess.
Oh, no, right. So so another person asked a question about sort of ethics and AI. And obviously a very broad and complicated question, because you can use AI for good, you can use it for nefarious purposes. But there's also the issue of, even when you're using it for a good purpose, like to try to control the pandemic, there are going to be some ethical tensions. Like, the more data we scrape and gather and train machine learning onto, the more we can predict things. But there can be privacy concerns and even bad actors getting a hold of that information to use for their own not so benevolent surveillance goals. So it sounds like your company doesn't have to deal with those issues as much, because or do they? Are you dealing with any data that some folks might? You're not dealing with cell phone data. You're dealing with really scientific literature and molecule properties. Is that?
Yeah, we have to be exceptionally mindful, because it's also human health data, patient data.
Right. Okay.
And there's nothing more personal than your health. And safeguarding that data, whether it's kind of a HIPAA compliant environment or other environments, that data is incredibly valuable to a lot of people. So ensuring that the right standards are aired in Parliament and in Congress, the types of things that we need to be concerned about, and to ensure that there's the kind of integrity of systems, so that information doesn't get leaked out and be used or not used, just doesn't get leaked out.
Yeah.
Yep, at all. I think the ethical piece of it is always something that I get asked about. Admittedly, I
have it in your company's name, so you get to be asked about it.
Yeah, true. And I thought of this early on, and I understand more about the science that we use, the type of technologies that we create, how those, what they're trying to do, and understanding the ethical impact of this information has always been something that we've looked at. However, I didn't understand it when I started as well as I understand it now. I thought of it in terms of learning, and you can put a set of rules in place that govern how someone's going to act or react, and whether something's good or not good. You can put rules in place to kind of put boundaries in. And then I also thought, well, you can kind of teach some of those boundaries, or rather some a system can learn what ethically is valuable. And I thought, well, there's probably nothing that is more meaningful to humans than the preservation of that human health in there. And it's going to be learning on a series of data that preserves the essence of protecting humanity or whatever it is as part of that. I did think of that naively many years ago, having a more rudimentary understanding of how our technology works and the type of constraints and the biases that we are forever trying to ensure don't enter into our system, but also putting things in place that allow us to unblack box how our systems are working. It was less ethics driven and more kind of scientists demanded to have more of an understanding of how hypotheses are being derived at, how information is being curated and used in that way. And I always kind of chalk it down to scientists are a curious bunch. You can't tell them that this is going to do that. And they're like, oh, okay.
You got to trust me. The machine said.
Yeah.
And just to fill in for some in our audience. So among the ethical challenges that AI folks do need to be attentive to, like Ken is. Some of it is about privacy on the data you use. Some of it is about, can you just use the word bias, right? That if there are biases, even unintentional biases in the data that a machine learning system is trained on, then that bias can get ensconced into its algorithms. But a third ethical issue that you just mentioned is this, what some people call the black box function, that many AI systems, it's hard to probe why it thinks something is true, because it's looked at set patterns in big data or done other sorts of deep learning, and it can come up with things that we wouldn't see, and it can be hard to reconstruct. How did you come up with that? And that carries its own ethical issues, right? I mean, scientists will want to know, can I really trust? How would I validate, right? In democracies, if you're going to build policy on the basis of what AI says, right, you'd want to be able to probe how it came up with something to have transparency for democratic legitimacy. So I love that you bring, and you just did the 1, 2, 3, privacy, bias, transparency.
Yeah.
And how important all of them are to address.
Yeah, and yeah, so very early on in the system, we had to build that transparency as a function of our company working, because otherwise there would be a lot of skepticism with how well, why would I choose that hypothesis and not this hypothesis, which is my favorite hypothesis, you know?
Right.
Yeah. Which is itself biased. If the scientist says that's my favorite one, you know.
I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. So one person asked, this is sort of pulling away from COVID or even kind of broad ethics question, and asking, AI has a lot of hype right now in healthcare. So it's not necessarily COVID, but staying in healthcare. At what point do you see AI actually living up to its hype? And many people in healthcare are afraid of losing their jobs to AI eventually. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so there are 2 points in that. One is kind of job security as it relates to the scientists, and I'm usually, or I try to be very clear where AI is in its in its development, whether it's a mature technology or it's developing technology, and this technology is not anywhere near as smart as a human scientist. It can't reason as well as a human scientist can reason. Where it has its advantages is it just knows so much more, right? It can see everything, so it can make assessments based on, I'm not going to say the totality of information, because much of the information that it has is filling in its own blank. It's effectively making hypotheses that give you this puzzle, or give you a better picture of what this puzzle looks like. And it can reason, to the extent that it has its reasoning capabilities over this vast amount of information. And I think of them as variables. And I can probably hold, I don't know how many variables I can hold in my head, but not very many. And a system that can hold 160 million plus variables in its head has capabilities that I don't have. So bringing these two very smart things together, and augmenting the one who's really clever, which is the human scientist, with the ability to go through vast amount of information in a synthesized sort of way. So I don't see a human scientist losing his job anytime soon, or her job anytime soon, because the technology hasn't come up to that standard. There's often a debate around, automation versus artificial intelligence, and automation is certainly impacting jobs. And to some extent, artificial intelligence is at kind of the back office side of things. And in healthcare, you see, annotating patient records and all sorts of things which a human can do, but a machine can do that just faster, with more accuracy, so on and so forth. So undoubtedly there is an impact, and I think that it hits really two ends of the spectrum. So the more professional services, say it's legal or clinicians or drug development, is impacted and will continue to be impacted. And then at the other end, there's kind of the automation side of things, which is also being impacted. And there's a whole bunch of gray space in the middle of that we're seeing, kind of increasing systems develop into that space at the moment. What was the other part of the question?
No, you answered all of it. So
okay.
Here's the last question, and we just have a couple of minutes left. What are you most hopeful about with AI? So we agree that it's complex, and we have to pay attention at every moment to the ethics of it and the social implications like jobs.
Yeah.
At the same time, it has enormous promise. So yeah. I don't know, among the things you're most excited by as potential, which I mean to have a little realism. So don't do the full sci-fi version, okay? Yeah. Yeah. But around the corner, it really may allow us to what?
Yeah, well, I'll focus on the health side of things, because it's an area that I know more than others, and I could kind of wax nostalgia on other aspects that I'm really interested in as well. But I think some near-term horizons on thing is an increasing understanding of what a disease is when before it had a common diagnosis. And years ago, patients would be diagnosed with breast cancer or with liver cancer, and now we have the understanding that it may be a HER2 mutation or it's a BRCA mutation, and if you try to treat a BRCA mutation with Herceptin, it's not going to work because it's not the same disease. Yeah. And the same, right? So what was a disease before is no longer a disease. And as we understand disease better and better, we can fine-tune the treatments for those. And what I find exciting about, or what I find near term for that, is that there could be hundreds of drugs that have failed in hitting a broad indication because they didn't have the right patients. They grouped patients as having breast cancer when they should have grouped them as having
this mutation or something.
This mutation in it.
Yes.
And that's across the board, whether it's Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease or...
So that we might already have a lot of drugs whose potential hasn't been understood.
Exactly. And those can be trialed because if you understand who your patients are, they can be small clinical studies.
Much more targeted, yeah.
And I think of it, if I'm a CEO of Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson, I have all these failed drugs. If I have a way to monetize that for my shareholders, great. you know, and even better from my perspective to start treating patients with
Saves lives.
that. It's, you know,
Win-win, we
yes,
like.
a win-win. So I don't feel like we're a million miles away from that. You know, we're as an industry, we continue to make better and more informed decisions about our understanding of disease, and more clinical studies, you know, certainly the ones that we're doing, but others are doing, are very, very targeted to specific patient populations that would be on a disease. They would look homogeneous, but actually they're not the same disease.
Yeah.
They just look the same, but they're not.
Yeah, it's again sort of looking under the hood and finding out what's really wrong with the car. I'm sad personally to say that we're out of time, but Ken, can I just say thank you? And here's Dean Almeida again to close us out.
Okay, well, thank you. It was a pleasure.
I've never, again, I told you I felt inadequate before, and I feel even more inadequate now. This is so fascinating. There's so much to learn. There's so much to understand. Thanks for exciting us about this topic and giving us some insights. Maggie, thank you for moderating this. It was a wonderful discussion. I hope you'll both come back and continue to help us make progress, understand the role of AI and medicine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks again, Ken.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.